Imagine lying on a wooden plank, frost forming on your eyelashes, and your only blanket is your kotif, your lucky dot, in 1600s Russia. The winter night didn't just whisper a bit. Homes were smoky, drafty, and unforgiving. No insulation. No central heat. Just you. Your breath in the air and the creeping cold gnawing at your bones. Sleep wasn't rest. It was survival. Craving a warm bed after that image. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to drift into more chilling bedtime tales. From history and tell us would you have made it through just one winter night in old Russia. Picture this. You wake up in 1600s Russia, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the biting cold seeping through the wooden walls, nor the frost patterns painting intricate designs on the single small window. It's the gentle warmth radiating from the massive structure dominating the center of your one-room dwelling, the peka, the Russian stove that would quite literally determine whether you lived or died through the endless months of winter. The name itself tells the story of survival. The Russian word for peasant hut comes from the ancient term meaning the one being heated. Not the one being built or the one being lived in, but heated. This linguistic evolution reveals something profound about Russian priorities. Warmth wasn't a luxury, it was existence itself. The stove didn't exist to serve the house. The house existed to serve the stove. Your day would begin not with stretching in bed, but with carefully descending from the Perikreech code, the flat top of the stove where you spent the night. This wasn't some primitive sleeping arrangement born of necessity. Russia documents how the most prestigious place to sleep in a traditional peasant household was not a bed, but was situated on the stove under the ceiling. The stove's apex, just inches from the wooden beams above, remained the warmest spot in the entire dwelling, maintaining a comfortable temperature of 25 to 27 degrees Celsius even when the outdoor temperature plummeted to -30 or below. But understanding the Russian stove requires appreciating its magnificent complexity. This wasn't simply a fireplace with a chimney. The peka was a masterpiece of thermal engineering, constructed with walls 25 to 40 centimeters thick, designed to capture, store, and slowly release every precious calorie of heat generated by burning wood. The construction process itself was a community affair, requiring specialized knowledge passed down through generations of stove builders who understood the precise angles, chambers, and passages necessary to maximize heat retention. While ensuring proper ventilation, the stove's internal architecture resembled a maze designed by physics itself. Hot gases from the fire would travel through a complex network of channels within the brick walls, surrendering their heat to the thermal mass before finally escaping through the chimney. This meant that a single fire, properly laid and tended, could keep the interior warm for an entire day and well into the night. Russia notes that even during the most bitter winter frost, it could maintain a warm temperature in the house on a single fire throughout the day. Your morning routine would begin with the ritual of fire maintenance. The previous evening's coals, carefully banked and protected, needed to be coaxed back to life. This wasn't a matter of simply tossing on more wood. The art of Russian firekeeping involved understanding the precise balance of airflow, fuel placement, and timing that would allow the stove to reach optimal efficiency. Too much wood too quickly, and precious heat would escape up the chimney. Too little, and the thermal mass wouldn't store enough energy to last through the day. The stove served multiple functions that modern heating systems divide among numerous appliances. The main firebox was where bread was baked hand in 1600s Russia. This meant dense, dark rye bread that could sustain a family for days. The residual heat after bread making was perfect for drying clothes, herbs, and other necessities. Side chambers stored cooking implements, and strategically placed niches held water containers, preventing them from freezing solid during the harshest winter nights. But perhaps most remarkably, the Russian stove served as the family's bathing. Facility. After the main heating and cooking functions were complete, the stove's interior could be swept clean, and family members would crawl inside the spacious firebox for steam baths. This practice, documented by numerous foreign travelers to Russia, seemed almost impossibly primitive to Western Europeans. Yet it represented a sophisticated understanding of maximizing the utility of precious fuel resources. The stove also functioned as a social center. Children too young to work would spend their days near its warmth, learning essential skills from their elders. Women would use the heat for textile work, spinning, weaving, and the endless mending that kept families clothed through winter months that could extend from October through April. The saying, "the warm kingdom is a peasant hut with a stove," reflected not just physical comfort, but social cohesion. Understanding the Russian stove means grasping how precarious life was without it. Foreign travelers consistently noted the absolute dependence Russian peasants had on their heating systems. Russia records how Adam O'Learius, a German traveler in the 1630s, observed that Russians would line the floor of the sleigh with felt and lay on it in our long sheepskin coats. Cover the sleigh with a felt or woolen rug. This kept us warm. And we even sweated and slept as the peasants drove our sleigh onward. Even when traveling, Russians treated transportation as a mobile heating system. The stove's construction required materials that weren't always available. Clay suitable for fire-resistant bricks wasn't found everywhere, and the specialized knowledge of stove building was carefully guarded. A family without a properly functioning stove faced death by freezing, and repairs during winter months were nearly impossible. This created a social hierarchy based not just on land ownership or political power, but on access to thermal engineering expertise. Yet for all its sophistication, the Russian stove revealed the brutal mathematics of survival in the Little Ice. Age. The period from 1600 to 1720 represented some of the coldest temperatures in recorded history, and Russia bore the brunt of this climatic catastrophe. Historical document how cold weather led to a crop failure, which was followed by bad harvests in 1602 and 1603. The stove that had sustained life for generations suddenly wasn't enough when the weather turned truly apocalyptic. But how did families manage the constant need for fuel? How did they balance the daily requirements of firekeeping with the endless other tasks necessary for survival? And what happened when the wood ran out? The relationship between a Russian peasant family and their fuel supply in the 1600s was intimate and desperate in ways that modern heating bills can barely suggest. Every piece of wood that entered the stove represented hours of labor, careful planning, and often considerable risk. The mathematics were unforgiving. Insufficient fuel meant death, but gathering fuel exposed families to dangers that could prove equally fatal. Your typical day in winter would begin with a fuel assessment that determined everything else that could happen. The night's fire had consumed a specific amount of wood, and replacing that supply wasn't simply a matter of stepping outside to a convenient woodpile. In the depths of the Little Ice Age, with temperatures that could remain below -20 Celsius for weeks at a time, gathering fuel required expedition-level planning. The preferred fuel was birch, which burned hot and clean, but birch trees didn't grow everywhere, and those that did exist were often claimed by whoever had the power to claim them. Pine and fir were more readily available, but they produced dangerous creosote buildup in the stove's complex chimney systems. Oak was ideal, but rare this far north. Most families relied on whatever they could gather, trade, for or-win desperation. Steel, the gathering process itself was a family affair that revealed the harsh social dynamics of survival. Men would venture into forests that might be several kilometers from home, using wooden sleds to drag back whatever deadfall they could find. This wasn't the systematic forestry of later centuries. Russia describes how Russian peasants developed sophisticated techniques for identifying which trees were dead enough to burn efficiently, but not so rotten as to produce minimal heat. But gathering deadfall wasn't enough. Living trees had to be cut, and this required tools that were precious and often inadequate. Iron axes were expensive and required regular sharpening by blacksmiths who might be days of travel away. Many families relied on wooden tools with small iron edges, making tree cutting an exhausting, time-consuming process. A full day's work might yield only enough fuel for 2 or 3 days of heating, creating a constant deficit that defined the rhythm of winter survival. The preparation of fuel was almost as important as its gathering. Wood had to be split 2 sizes that would fit properly in the stove's firebox. But splitting frozen wood with inadequate tools could result in injury that would prove fatal in conditions where medical help was non-existent. Wet wood had to be dried, but the only warm, dry place was near the stove, creating a constant competition for space between fuel storage and human habitation. Storage presented its own challenges. Fuel had to be kept dry but accessible, protected from theft, but available for quick retrieval during blizzards that could last for days. Most families stored wood inside their living spaces, further reducing the already cramped quarters. The smell of drying wood, mixed with smoke, cooking, food, and human habitation, created an atmosphere that foreign visitors found almost overwhelming. The social dimensions of fuel gathering revealed how survival in 1600s Russia was never an individual affair. Families formed informal cooperatives with different members specializing in different aspects of the fuel supply chain. Children too young for heavy labor would gather kindling and bark, while older family members handled the dangerous work of tree felling. Women often took responsibility for managing the stove itself, developing an almost supernatural ability to maintain steady heat with minimal fuel consumption. But fuel gathering was also a source of constant conflict. Forest ownership was often unclear or disputed, and families desperate for fuel might venture onto lands claimed by nobility or the Orthodox Church. The penalties for fuel theft could be severe, but the penalty for having no fuel was death. Historical records from the time document how entire villages succumbed or were abandoned as the starving wandered, desperately looking for food, but they might equally have wandered, looking for fuel to keep their stoves burning. The efficiency of fuel use was a skill passed down through generations and jealously guarded. Experienced stovekeepers could make a day's worth of wood last nearly 2 days through precise control of airflow, strategic banking of coals, and careful timing of when to add fresh fuel. This knowledge was particularly crucial for women, who often spent entire days managing the stove while men were away gathering more wood. Alternative fuels became important when wood was scarce. Dried animal dung, straw, and even bones could supplement wood supplies. Each alternative required different burning techniques and produced different qualities of heat. Dung burned slowly and produced steady heat but created acrid smoke. Straw burned quickly and required constant attention. Bones provided intense heat but were difficult to ignite. The seasonal rhythm of fuel gathering defined the Russian peasant year. Spring and summer were spent not just growing food, but identifying, cutting, and preparing the enormous quantities of fuel that would be needed for the 6 to 8 months of winter heating. Families that fell behind in their fuel preparation during the warm months faced disaster when winter arrived during the worst years of the Little Ice Age. When crop failures were accompanied by exceptionally harsh winters, fuel gathering became a matter of life and death competition. Records from describe how cold weather led to a crop failure, which was followed by bad harvests in 1602 and 1603. Families weakened by famine had less energy to gather fuel, creating a death spiral where inadequate nutrition made fuel gathering impossible, while inadequate fuel made survival impossible. The psychological impact of constant fuel. Anxiety shaped Russian peasant culture in profound ways. the fear of running out of wood was omnipresent, influencing decisions about travel, social gatherings, and even reproduction. Families might postpone marriages or delay having children. If their fuel situation was precarious, understanding that additional family members meant additional heating requirements they might not be able to meet. But what happened during those inevitable moments when fuel ran out? How did families survive? When their carefully hoarded wood supplies were exhausted and no more could be obtained? And what desperate measures did people resort to when their stoves went cold? The moment when a Russian peasant stove went cold, in the depths of winter, wasn't just the end of warmth. It was the beginning of a countdown to death that could be measured in hours rather than days. The thermal mass that made these stoves so efficient at retaining heat also meant that once they cooled completely, restarting then became a race against time that many families lost. In the depths of the Little Ice Age, when outdoor temperatures could remain at -30°C for weeks, a cold stove meant that indoor temperatures would drop to lethal levels within hours. Foreign observers like Louis-Philippe D. noted that Russians were prepared for extreme cold with bearskin furs, which we wore over finer and more valuable clothes also made of fur. But such preparations were designed for temporary exposure, not for extended periods without heat. The first signs of a failing fuel supply were subtle but terrifying to those who understood their implications. The stove would begin to cool more quickly than usual after feeding, requiring more frequent additions of fuel to maintain temperature. The top of the stove, where family members slept, would become uncomfortable rather than cozy. Frost would begin to form on the interior walls of the dwelling, starting in corners and gradually spreading inward. When fuel supplies were completely exhausted, families faced several desperate options, none of them satisfactory. The most immediate was to burn anything combustible within the dwelling itself. Furniture, tools, parts of the building structure, everything became potential fuel. Historical accounts from the time describe how desperate families would burn their own possessions to stay alive, essentially consuming their future survival prospects to extend their lives by a few more days. Some families attempted to maintain body heat through purely physiological means. Everyone would gather on or near the cooling stove, sharing body warmth under every available covering. This was the origin of the phrase that would inspire our title without blankets, which many peasant families couldn't afford. People would indeed snap from the combination of cold and the psychological stress of impending death. The practice of sleeping in shifts emerged during fuel crises. Family members would take turns staying awake to maintain whatever small heat source remained, perhaps a tiny flame fed with splinters of furniture or scraps of cloth. The person on watch would move constantly to maintain circulation, while others tried to sleep in whatever warmth remained. But the most desperate measure was abandoning the dwelling entirely. When stoves went cold and couldn't be restarted, entire families would sometimes attempt to reach neighbors, relatives, or communities where fuel might be available. These winter migrations were extraordinarily dangerous. Travel in 1600s Russian required specialized equipment and knowledge that not everyone possessed. Families that set out unprepared often died within hours of leaving their homes. The social dynamics of fuel crises revealed both the best and worst of human nature. Some communities developed sharing systems where families with surplus fuel would take in neighbors whose stoves had gone cold. But these arrangements often came with steep prices, labor obligations, property transfers, or marriage arrangements that would bind families for generations. The phrase fuel debt described obligations that could last longer than the winter that created them. Churches sometimes served as warming centers during the worst fuel crises, but this created its own problems. Orthodox religious practices included lengthy services in unheated buildings, and churches weren't designed as shelters for large numbers of people. The concentration of desperate families in small spaces led to disease transmission that could kill more people than the cold itself. The psychological impact of a cold stove was devastating in ways that pure physical discomfort couldn't explain. The stove was the center of family life, the symbol of home, the marker of survival. When it went cold, families often experienced a kind of psychological collapse that made effective survival responses even more difficult. Historians describe how people would sit motionless beside their cold stoves, not even attempting to find alternative solutions. Children were often the first casualties of fuel crises. Their smaller body mass made them vulnerable to hypothermia more quickly than adults, and their higher metabolic needs meant they required more warmth to maintain normal body functions. The practice of prioritizing heat for children led to situations where parents would sacrifice their own warmth, sometimes fatally, to keep their offspring alive. The aftermath? A fuel crisis shaped Russian peasant culture in profound ways. Families that survived developed almost obsessive approaches to fuel storage and management. Children who lived through winters when stoves went cold carried that trauma into adulthood, becoming almost compulsive about maintaining fuel supplies. The cultural memory of cold stoves influenced Russian approaches to home construction, community organization, and resource management for generations. But perhaps most significantly, the experience of cold stoves during the Little Ice Age helped create the Russian concept of community survival that would define the culture for centuries. The understanding that individual family survival was impossible during the worst winters led to cooperative arrangements that transcended normal social boundaries. Yet even these hard-won survival strategies couldn't address the fundamental problem. Where does the fuel come from when the forests are exhausted? The trees are frozen, too hard to cut, and the community's resources are depleted. How did Russian peasants create the very shelters that housed their life-saving stoves, and what happened when those shelters themselves began to fail? Imagine trying to construct shelter when the ground is frozen solid to a depth of several feet. When every piece of usable timber must be cut by hand with primitive tools. And when the weather itself seems determined to kill you before you can complete the work. This was the reality facing Russian peasants in the early 1600s. When the collapse of central authority during the time of troubles coincided with some of the harshest winter conditions in recorded history. The izba, the traditional Russian log house, wasn't simply a building. It was a complex survival technology that had evolved over centuries to address the specific challenges of surviving in the world's harshest climate zone. But during the time of troubles, when entire villages succumbed or were abandoned as the starving wandered, desperately looking for the knowledge and resources necessary to build these life-saving structures, were themselves under threat. Construction of an izba traditionally began in late spring or early summer, when the ground had thawed sufficiently to allow foundation work and when timber could be transported more easily. But the chaos of the early 1600s often disrupted these seasonal rhythms. Families displaced by warfare, famine, or social collapse might find themselves needing shelter in the depths of winter, when construction under normal circumstances would be impossible. The foundation process revealed the sophisticated understanding Russian builders had developed of their challenging environment. Traditional izba began with selecting a site that would provide natural drainage while offering protection from prevailing winds. The foundation itself was minimal. By design, logs were placed directly on the ground or on simple stone supports, allowing the building to shift with the freeze-thaw cycles that could destroy rigid foundations. But during the time of troubles, site selection often depended on factors other than optimal building conditions. Families might need to build in locations that offered concealment from marauding armies, proximity to water sources that hadn't been contaminated by warfare, or access to whatever timber remained. After years of conflict had depleted easily accessible forests, the result was often structures built in less than ideal locations, making them harder to heat and more vulnerable to weather damage. The timber selection process required expertise that was typically passed down through generations. The best logs came from trees that had been marked for cutting years in advance. allowing them to dry properly while still standing. Pine was preferred for its straight grain and resistance to decay, but birch and other hardwoods were also used. During the time of troubles, however, builders often had to work with whatever timber they could obtain, including green wood that would shrink and crack as it dried, creating gaps that let in deadly winter air. The actual construction process was a community affair that revealed the cooperative nature of Russian peasant society. Traditional construction involved simple axes, adzes, chisels, and wooden pegs. No nails were used, partly because metal was expensive and scarce, but also because wooden joinery was more flexible, allowing the building to move with seasonal changes without structural failure. The log-laying technique, called chashi or cups, involved cutting precisely fitted notches in each log so that they would lock together securely. This required skill that took years to develop and knowledge of wood behavior that couldn't be learned from books. Each log had to be positioned to account for its natural taper and grain direction, with gaps filled using moss, hemp, or other insulating materials. But during the crisis years of the early 1600s, skilled builders were often unavailable. Men might be away fighting in various armies, dead from famine or disease, or engaged in other survival activities. This meant that construction often fell to women, children, and elderly men who lacked the physical strength or technical knowledge for optimal building. The result was often structures that were adequate for survival, but far from the sophisticated buildings that experienced. Craftsmen could create. The roof construction was perhaps the most critical aspect of the entire building process. Winters brought not just cold, but enormous snow loads that could collapse inadequately supported roofs. The traditional solution was a steep-pitched roof that would shed snow quickly, supported by massive interior beams that distributed weight evenly. But these beams required large trees that were increasingly difficult to find, as forests were depleted by the demands of warfare and survival. The covering material for roofs was usually wooden shingles, split by hand from carefully selected logs. But shingle making was time-consuming, skilled work that required tools many families couldn't afford. During emergencies, roofs might be covered with sod, bark, or whatever materials could be found. These temporary solutions often lasted longer than intended, creating buildings that were perpetually on the verge of failure. Window installation represented a particular challenge in Russian construction. Glass was unknown to most peasants, and even thin sheets of mica were expensive. Most windows were simply holes in the walls that could be covered with wooden shutters or translucent materials like fish bladders or oiled cloth. The balance between light and heat retention was crucial to many windows, meant heat loss. But to few made interior work impossible during the long winter months. The interior layout of an izba is determined by the massive stove that would dominate the living space. The entire building was essentially designed around this heating system, with the stove's foundation often being the first part of the structure to be built. The placement affected everything else: sleeping areas, cooking spaces, storage, and the all-important circulation patterns that would allow heat to reach every part of the dwelling. During the time of troubles, when families were often building under emergency conditions, this careful integration of building and heating system was sometimes compromised. Hastily constructed buildings might have stoves that were poorly positioned, creating cold spots that made parts of the dwelling uninhabitable. Or the stove might be too large for the space, consuming precious fuel without providing proportional warmth to finishing work on an izba. Included chinking, filling gaps between logs with materials that would expand and contract with seasonal changes without falling out. Traditional chinking used moss, animal hair, and clay, but during emergencies, builders used whatever was available. Improper chinking could make an otherwise well-built structure nearly uninhabitable by allowing cold air to penetrate throughout. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of building during the time of troubles was the uncertainty about how long any structure would need to last. Families might invest enormous effort in construction only to be forced to abandon their homes due to warfare, famine, or social upheaval. This uncertainty led to a focus on speed over durability, creating buildings that might survive a single winter but fail under the stress of repeated seasonal cycles. What happened when these hastily built emergency shelters began to fail in the middle of winter? How did families repair structures when the very materials and tools needed for construction were unavailable? And what innovations did desperate builders develop when traditional methods proved inadequate for crisis conditions? When an ISBA began to fail in the depths of winter, the race to make repairs became a battle against time measured, not in days, but in hours before the structure became uninhabitable. The same extreme conditions that made the shelter necessary also made repairs extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, creating a cycle of deterioration that could turn a minor maintenance issue into a life-threatening emergency. The most common winter failures were gaps opening in the chinking between logs. As temperatures dropped far below freezing, the various materials used to seal these gaps would contract at different rates, creating openings that allowed precious warm air to escape and deadly cold air to enter. Traditional Russian anticipated this problem, but buildings constructed hastily during the time of troubles often used inadequate or improper chinking materials that failed under extreme stress. Detecting these failures required constant vigilance. Family members would wake to find frost forming on interior walls in new patterns, indicating that cold air was penetrating somewhere it hadn't before. The search for the source of these air leaks became a desperate treasure hunt where failure to find and seal the breach could mean the difference between life and death for the entire family. Repairing chinking in winter. Temperatures required materials that remained workable in extreme cold. Traditional clay-based chinking would freeze solid, making application impossible. Emergency repairs often used whatever organic materials were available: animal dung mixed with straw, scraps of cloth, even human hair pressed into gaps and held in place with wooden wedges or strips of bark. But working outside in winter conditions presented its own deadly challenges. Exposed skin would freeze within minutes at the temperatures common during the Little Ice Age. Tools became almost impossible to handle as metal conducted heat away from unprotected hands faster than the body could replace it. Even the simple act of cleaning debris from a gap before applying new chinking could result in frostbite that would later prove fatal if infection set in. The repair work had to be done in shifts, with workers spending only minutes at a time outside before returning to the warmth of the stove. This made complex repairs nearly impossible and meant that even simple tasks took hours to complete. Meanwhile, heat continued to escape through the damaged areas, making the interior colder and more difficult to warm, even as the family burned precious fuel at increased rates. Roof repairs were perhaps the most dangerous winter maintenance tasks. Snow loads that accumulated on Russian roofs could reach enormous weights, and the snow itself often provided insulation that helped keep buildings warm. But when roofs began to leak or sag under the weight, repairs couldn't wait for spring. Working on an icy roof in winter, clothing that restricted movement using tools that became brittle in extreme cold, was an activity that killed experienced builders regularly. The temporary solutions developed for winter roof repairs revealed both the ingenuity and desperation of Russian peasants facing structural failures. Weighted tarps made from sewn animal hides could be positioned to divert water away from leak points. Interior supports could be improvised using furniture or salvaged timber to prevent roof collapse. But these emergency measures often created new problems. Supports placed incorrectly could interfere with heat circulation, while tarps could trap moisture that would cause rot once warmer weather arrived. Foundation problems were particularly insidious because they were often impossible to detect until serious damage had occurred. Frost heaving could lift sections of the building, creating gaps in the log walls that were difficult to identify and almost impossible to repair in winter. Conditions. Buildings constructed on inadequate foundations during the emergency conditions of the time of troubles were especially vulnerable to this type of failure. When foundation movement created significant gaps in walls, families sometimes resorted to interior repairs that involved hanging additional coverings inside the dwelling. Animal hides, layers of clothing, or whatever fabric could be spared would be stretched across interior walls to create dead air spaces that provided additional insulation. These interior modifications could make a marginally habitable building survivable, but they also reduced the already cramped living space and created hiding places for vermin and insects. Tool maintenance became critical during winter repair season. The axes, adzes, and other implements necessary for building work were also essential for fuel gathering and food preparation. A broken tool in winter could be impossible to repair or replace, making even simple maintenance tasks impossible. Families learned to maintain multiple backup tools and to baby their primary implements with obsessive care. The social dynamics of winter repairs revealed the cooperative nature of Russian peasant communities. Neighbors would share tools, expertise, and labor for emergency repairs, understanding that a building failure could affect more than just the immediate family. A collapsed roof or a failed heating system could force a family to seek shelter with neighbors, straining resources throughout the community. But the same harsh conditions that made cooperation necessary also made it difficult travel between. Houses might be impossible during blizzards, and families with their own maintenance crises couldn't always provide help. Material scavenging for winter. Repairs became an art form that required intimate knowledge of what resources might be available. In the immediate area, abandoned buildings from families that hadn't survived could provide timber, chinking materials, or hardware. But scavenging also carried risk. Structures that had been abandoned might be unstable, and disturbing them could be dangerous. Additionally, ownership of abandoned property was often unclear, creating potential legal problems if original owners or their relatives returned. The psychological stress of constant building maintenance in winter conditions was enormous. Families lived with the knowledge that their shelter could fail at any time, requiring immediate response under conditions that made effective action nearly impossible. The sound of wind against the building became a source of constant anxiety, as any new noise might indicate structural failure. Sleep was often interrupted by the need to check for new problems or to tend repairs that required ongoing attention. But what innovations did families develop when traditional repair methods proved inadequate? What happened when the building materials themselves were no longer available, forcing builders to experiment with alternatives that had never been tested under extreme conditions? The extreme conditions of the time of troubles combined with the unprecedented cold of the Little Ice Age forced Russian peasants to develop building innovations that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. When traditional materials were unavailable and conventional construction methods proved inadequate, survival itself depended on the ability to improvise solutions using whatever resources could be found. One of the most remarkable innovations was the development of composite chinking materials that performed better than traditional methods under extreme conditions. Normal clay-based would freeze solid and crack in severe cold, but desperate builders discovered that mixing organic materials in specific proportions could create sealants that remained flexible even at temperatures far below freezing. Human hair, animal fur, dried blood, and even ground bone were combined with whatever binding agents could be found to create chinking compounds that were both flexible and insulating. These biological materials had the advantage of being available, even when traditional building supplies were not, but they also attracted vermin and created sanitation problems that could lead to disease outbreaks in the confined spaces of winter shelters. The use of snow itself as a building material represented another desperate innovation. While snow was obviously not suitable for permanent construction, it could be used to create temporary windbreaks, insulating barriers, and even emergency shelters. Russian peasants developed techniques for packing snow into blocks that could be used like masonry, creating walls that provided significant protection from wind while offering surprising insulation value. But snow construction required understanding its different properties under various temperature conditions. Snow that was too cold wouldn't pack properly, while snow near the melting point would collapse under its own weight. The optimal snow for construction existed within a narrow temperature range, and builders had to work quickly before conditions changed. Emergency snow shelters could be built in hours, but they required constant maintenance and could collapse without warning if temperatures rose even slightly. Interior heating innovations became necessary when traditional stove systems couldn't provide adequate warmth for poorly constructed or damaged buildings. Families developed systems of heated stones that could be warmed in the stove and then used to provide localized heat for sleeping or work areas. These portable heat sources could extend the effective heating range of a failing stove system, but they also presented fire hazards that killed families who used them improperly. The technique of creating heat walls involved building secondary walls inside existing structures, creating dead air spaces that provided additional insulation. These interior walls were constructed using whatever materials were available: layers of clothing, animal hides, salvaged timber, or even tightly packed organic materials like straw or leaves. While effective at improving insulation, these modifications made interior spaces extremely cramped and created fire hazards that increased as materials dried out near heating sources. Ventilation innovations were necessary because many emergency building techniques created structures that were too airtight, leading to problems with carbon monoxide poisoning and oxygen depletion. Traditional Russian buildings had carefully designed ventilation systems that balanced air quality with heat retention. But emergency construction often ignored these considerations in favor of maximum heat conservation. Families learned to create small, controllable vents that could be opened periodically to refresh interior air without losing too much heat. Some builders developed techniques for creating double-walled construction using whatever materials were available. The principle was similar to modern insulated construction: two walls with an insulating space between them, but the materials were whatever could be scrounged. Outer walls might be constructed of salvaged timber, while inner walls used woven branches, animal hides, or even tightly packed snow. The insulating space between would be filled with organic materials like leaves, straw, or animal fur. The development of modular construction techniques allowed families to build shelters that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as circumstances changed. During the chaos of the time of troubles, families might need to relocate with little notice, and traditional construction methods were too permanent for these conditions. Modular systems used standardized joints and components that could be quickly assembled using simple tools, creating buildings that were adequate for survival even if they weren't optimal for long-term habitation. Underground construction innovations involved creating partially subterranean shelters that took advantage of the Earth's insulating properties. Even during the Little Ice Age, ground temperatures below the frost line remained warmer than surface temperatures. Families would excavate partial basements or root cellars that could serve as emergency shelters when above-ground structures failed. These underground spaces were naturally insulated and could be heated with minimal fuel, but they also presented problems with moisture, ventilation, and structural stability. The innovation of heat recovery systems involved capturing and reusing waste heat that would normally be lost. Families developed techniques for routing heated air from cooking and other activities through interior spaces before it escaped to the outside. Simple systems of internal ducts made from hollow logs or improvised from salvaged materials could significantly improve the heating efficiency of marginal stove systems. Water management innovations became critical when traditional drainage systems failed or were inadequate for emergency construction. Melting snow and ice could create flooding problems inside buildings, while inadequate drainage could lead to foundation problems that would cause structural failure. Emergency construction often included improvised guttering systems, made from split logs or improvised channels that directed water away from critical structural elements. The development of emergency repair kits reflected the understanding that building failures were inevitable and that repairs would need to be made under conditions that made obtaining new materials impossible. Families would stockpile small quantities of repair materials, pieces of chinking compound, spare wooden wedges, scraps of fabric or hide that could be used for patches, and small tools that could be used for emergency maintenance. These repair kits were often the difference between survival and death when structural failures occurred during the worst winter weather, but perhaps the most significant innovation was the development of community building standards that helped ensure that emergency construction would be adequate for survival, even when built by inexperienced workers. These informal standards included simple rules for foundation depth, wall thickness, roof pitch, and stove placement that could be remembered and applied by anyone who needed to build shelter quickly. While these standards didn't produce optimal buildings, they helped ensure that emergency construction would provide adequate protection for families who had no other options. The psychological innovations were perhaps as important as the physical ones. Families developed mental techniques for coping with the constant stress of living in marginal shelters that could fail at any time. These included rituals for checking structural integrity, systems for rotating responsibility for building maintenance, and methods for maintaining morale when living conditions were barely adequate for survival. Yet even these desperate innovations couldn't address the fundamental challenge facing Russian peasants during the time of troubles. What happened when families were forced to leave their shelters entirely? How did people survive when no building, no matter how ingeniously constructed or desperately maintained, could provide adequate protection against the combination of warfare, famine, and unprecedented cold that characterized the early years of the 17th century? The decision to abandon an izba during the Russian winter was never made lightly, because it was essentially a decision to choose one form of probable death over another. Yet during the time of troubles, when entire villages succumbed or were abandoned as the starving wandered, desperately looking for, countless families faced exactly this impossible choice. The question wasn't whether leaving was dangerous, was whether staying had become even more dangerous. The triggers for winter abandonment varied, but they all shared the common element of making continued survival in place impossible. Military campaigns could destroy buildings, food stores, and fuel supplies, leaving families with structures that couldn't be heated and no resources to maintain them. The chaos of the early brought not just Russian armies, but Polish forces, Swedish troops, and various rebel groups, any of which might decide that a particular village or a region was too dangerous to occupy or too valuable to leave in peasant hands. But warfare was only one factor driving winter migration. The failure of heating systems could make buildings uninhabitable, even when food and other resources were available. A collapsed chimney, a cracked stove, or structural damage that couldn't be repaired in winter conditions could transform a life-saving shelter into a death trap that offered the illusion of protection while actually accelerating heat loss and exposure. The decision-making process that led to winter abandonment revealed the brutal mathematics of survival that governed Russian peasant life. Families had to calculate whether their remaining fuel supplies were adequate to maintain life until spring, whether their food stores could sustain them through the remaining winter months, and whether their shelter would continue to provide protection against the elements. When any of these calculations suggested failure, the alternative of attempting to reach safety elsewhere began to seem reasonable. Despite its obvious dangers, Preparation for winter travel was limited by the same resource constraints that made travel necessary in the first place. Traditional Russian winter required specialized equipment, sleds that could carry supplies and weak family members, skis or snowshoes for walking on deep snow, and clothing designed specifically for extended exposure to extreme cold. But families abandoning their homes during emergencies rarely had access to optimal travel equipment. The clothing requirements for winter travel were extensive and expensive. Multiple layers of wool and fur were necessary to maintain body heat during extended exposure, while extremities required special protection to prevent frostbite. Foreign observers that Russians would wrap themselves in bearskin furs, which we wore over finer and more valuable clothes, also made of fur. Our heads were covered with sable hats. But such equipment was far beyond the means of most peasant families, even under normal circumstances. The improvised solutions for winter travel gear revealed both the ingenuity and desperation of families forced to abandon their homes. Multiple layers of ordinary clothing could provide some protection, but bulky clothing made walking difficult and increased the energy required for travel. Animal hides could be wrapped around feet and legs, but untreated skins were heavy when wet and could freeze solid, making walking impossible. Families learned to create makeshift snowshoes from bent wood and woven materials. But these emergency devices were crude and unreliable compared to professionally made equipment. The challenge of carrying supplies during winter travel created impossible choices about what to take and what to leave behind. Food was essential but heavy, and families rarely had enough stored food to sustain them for the entire journey to wherever they hoped to find shelter. Fuel for emergency fires was critical but bulky, and there was no guarantee that suitable firewood would be available along the route. Tools and implements necessary for survival were vital but added weight that could slow travel to a fatal degree. The social dynamics of group travel added complexity to winter migration decisions. Families with elderly members or small children faced the likelihood that these vulnerable individuals wouldn't survive the journey, while traveling alone eliminated the possibility of mutual assistance if individuals became sick or injured. The formation of travel groups provided some advantages, but also created competition for scarce resources and slowed travel to the pace of the weakest members. Navigation during winter travel was extraordinarily difficult in a landscape where familiar landmarks were buried under snow and where blizzard conditions could reduce visibility to a few feet. Russian peasants developed techniques for navigation using wind patterns, star positions, and subtle landscape features. But these methods required experience and knowledge that not everyone possessed. Getting lost during winter travel was usually fatal, and the pressure to maintain direction often led groups to continue traveling in dangerous conditions, when stopping to wait for better weather would have been safer. The daily routine of winter travel was governed by the need to balance progress with survival. Travelers had to start early enough to make maximum use of daylight hours, but late enough to allow for adequate preparation and assessment of weather conditions. Regular stops were necessary to check for signs of frostbite and to maintain circulation. But long stops meant loss of precious travel time and cooling of the body that required additional energy to reverse. Emergency shelter during travel was often the difference between life and death when weather conditions made continued progress impossible. Experienced travelers could construct emergency shelters using snow, salvaged materials, and natural features like rock overhangs or dense trees. But these survival shelters were temporary solutions that provided protection for hours rather than days, and families were usually forced to choose between continuing travel in dangerous conditions or risking death in inadequate emergency shelters. The physiological challenges of winter travel were compounded by the poor nutritional status of families who were abandoning their homes because of food shortages. Bodies weakened by malnutrition had reduced ability to generate heat and less resistance to cold-related injuries. Children and elderly family members were particularly vulnerable. And the energy requirements of winter travel often exceeded what malnourished individuals could sustain. But perhaps most challenging was the psychological stress of leaving behind everything familiar and venturing into unknown territory with no guarantee that the destination would offer better survival prospects than the situation being abandoned. The Izba represented not just shelter, but home, community, and connection to place. Abandoning it meant accepting that the life they had known was over and that survival depended on finding completely new arrangements in an uncertain and hostile world. What happened to families once they began these desperate winter journeys? How did they navigate not just the physical landscape, but the social and political complications of seeking shelter in communities that might not welcome additional mouths to feed during the hardest months of the year? Once a family committed to winter travel, they entered a landscape that was both physically treacherous and socially hostile. The Russia of the early 1600s was not a unified nation with established systems for helping travelers, but rather a lie. Patchwork of competing authorities, suspicious communities, and desperate individuals, all struggling to survive the combined catastrophes of the time of troubles and the Little Ice Age. The physical geography of winter travel was dominated by the challenge of navigating through snow that could be several feet deep and terrain that was unrecognizable compared to its summer appearance. Rivers that provided natural highways during warmer months were either frozen obstacles or dangerous crossing points where thin ice could break without warning. The harsh conditions of the Little Ice meant that waterways that had been reliable for generations might have different freezing patterns, creating new hazards for travelers who relied on traditional knowledge. Forest travel presented its own unique challenges. Dense woods could provide protection from wind and concealment from hostile groups, but they also made navigation difficult and limited visibility for detecting threats. Snow-laden branches could collapse without warning, injuring travelers or blocking paths. The forest floor, invisible under deep snow, might conceal fallen logs, holes, or other obstacles that could cause falls or injuries that would prove fatal far from any source of help. Open terrain offered advantages for navigation and threat detection, but provided no protection from wind or blizzard conditions. Travelers crossing open ground were visible from great distances, making them vulnerable to robbery or attack by the various armed groups that roamed the countryside during the time of troubles. The wind chill effects in open areas could make temperatures that were survivable in sheltered locations instantly lethal for anyone caught without adequate protection. The social geography of winter travel was equally treacherous. Villages that might have offered shelter and assistance under normal circumstances were often themselves struggling with survival and had no resources to share with outsiders. The breakdown of central authority during the time of troubles meant that local communities were forced to make their own decisions about how to deal with travelers. And these decisions were usually based on narrow calculations of local survival rather than broader humanitarian concerns. The phenomenon of winter begging became common during the crisis years, as families sought food and shelter from communities along their travel routes. But the distinction between desperate travelers and dangerous bandits was often unclear, and communities developed defensive responses that were hostile to all outsiders. Villages might post guards to turn away travelers, refuse to sell food or supplies, or even attack groups that approached their settlements. Religious communities represented potential sources of assistance, but they were also prime targets for various armed groups and were often unable to provide help even when willing to do so. Orthodox monasteries and had traditional obligations to provide charity. But these institutions were themselves under attack during the time of troubles, and many had been destroyed or abandoned by the time desperate families reached them. The timing of travel created additional complications. Winter travel had to Be coordinated with weather patterns that were unpredictable and potentially fatal. Clear, cold days were optimal for making progress, but blizzard conditions could trap travelers in the open with no protection. The short daylight hours of Russian winter meant that most travel had to be completed during a few hours of marginal light, while the long nights had to be spent in whatever shelter could be found or constructed. Food procurement during travel was a constant challenge that became more difficult as the journey progressed. Hunting required skills, tools, and time that traveling families often couldn't afford. Foraging in winter was nearly impossible in the snow-covered landscape. Trading for food required goods that families fleeing their homes rarely possessed. The result was that most families began their journeys with inadequate food supplies and became progressively weaker as travel continued. The economics of winter travel revealed the harsh realities of survival during the time of troubles. Families needed goods to trade for supplies, shelter, and passage. But the same circumstances that forced them to abandon their homes usually meant they had few valuable possessions. The items that were most valuable for trade tools, weapons, warm clothing were also the items most necessary for survival during the journey itself. Water procurement during winter. Travel required knowledge of where to find sources that weren't frozen solid and techniques for melting snow or ice safely. Eating snow directly was dangerous because it lowered body temperature and could cause hypothermia. But melting snow required fuel and time that travelers might not have. Finding flowing water meant locating springs or fast-moving streams that hadn't frozen. But these sources were often in locations that were difficult or dangerous to reach. The pace of winter travel was dictated by the capabilities of the weakest members of the group and the need to reach shelter before dark each day. Families with small children or elderly members moved much more slowly than groups of healthy adults. But abandoning vulnerable family members was not an option that most families would consider. The result was often travel at speeds that made reaching safe destinations before spring impossible. Emergency medical care during winter travel was limited to whatever knowledge and supplies families carried with them. Frostbite, hypothermia, injuries from falls, and illnesses brought on by exposure and malnutrition were common, but treatment options were minimal. A serious injury or illness during winter travel was usually fatal, not just for the individual affected but potentially for the entire group if the delay caused them to run out of supplies or be caught by severe weather. Communication during travel was limited to whatever information could be obtained from other travelers or from communities along the route. News about conditions ahead, the safety of potential destinations, or changes in political control could be days or weeks out of date by the time it reached traveling families. Decisions about routes and destinations had to be made based on incomplete and unreliable information, often leading families into situations that were worse than what they had left behind. But what happened when families finally reached their intended destinations only to discover that the communities they had hoped would provide shelter were themselves struggling to survive? How did refugee families negotiate for acceptance in places where their arrival meant additional strain on resources that were already inadequate for the existing population? The moment when winter refugees finally reached a potential destination, village monastery, or a town that might offer shelter marked the beginning of a complex negotiation process that would determine whether their desperate journey had saved them or merely postponed their deaths. The communities they approached were making their own brutal calculations about survival, weighing the moral obligation to help fellow Christians against the mathematical reality that additional mouths to feed might doom everyone. The initial reception of winter refugees revealed the social dynamics that governed survival during the time of troubles. Communities that had experienced their own losses and hardships were often suspicious of outsiders who might be carrying disease, fleeing from crimes, or serving as scouts for bandits or enemy armies. The process of gaining acceptance required refugees to prove not just their harmlessness, but their value to the community they hope to join. The most common arrangement for refugee families was some form of indenture or service obligation that would provide basic shelter and sustenance in exchange for labor or specialized skills. Able-bodied men might be required to contribute to community defense, construction projects, or resource gathering. Women with skills in textile production, food preparation, or medical care might find acceptance based on their ability to contribute essential services. But these arrangements often involved commitments that extended far beyond the immediate. Winter crisis. Children represented particular challenges in refugee negotiations. They consumed resources without contributing significant labor. And communities were often reluctant to accept families with multiple young children who would strain food supplies throughout the winter. Some families were forced to make the devastating choice of separating, placing children with different families or institutions in hopes that distribution would improve everyone's survival chances. The integration of refugees into existing communities required careful management of resources that were already stretched thin. Housing arrangements might involve multiple families sharing spaces that were designed for single families, creating overcrowding that led to conflict and disease transmission. Food distribution systems had to be modified to account for additional people, often requiring everyone to accept reduced rations to accommodate the legal obligations imposed on refugees. Families often involved the most dangerous and undesirable tasks that community members preferred to avoid. Refugees might be assigned to gather fuel in dangerous areas, maintain defenses during the coldest weather, or handle the bodies of those who died from disease or exposure. These assignments both contributed to community survival and served as tests of the refugees' commitment to their new situations. The economic arrangements between refugees and host communities revealed the harsh realities of survival during crisis periods. Refugee families might be required to surrender any valuable possessions they had managed to carry as payment for basic shelter and food. Future earnings or labor might be pledged for years in advance to cover the costs of winter survival. These arrangements often created permanent relationships of dependence that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. Disease management became a critical concern when refugees were integrated into existing communities. The concentration of people in inadequate housing combined with poor nutrition and sanitation created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases that could quickly kill more people than the winter cold. Communities developed screening procedures for newcomers and quarantine, arrangements that sometimes meant refugees died of exposure while waiting to be admitted to shelter. The social hierarchies that THA developed within refugee communities reflected both traditional status distinctions and the new realities created by the crisis. Families with valuable skills or resources might achieve better treatment and accommodations, while those who could only offer unskilled labor might find themselves in situations that were barely better than being homeless. Children who were separated from their families often found themselves at the bottom of these hierarchies, surviving on whatever charity could be spared. The psychological challenges of refugee status were compounded by the uncertainty about how long the arrangements would last and what would happen when winter ended. Families that had owned their own land and buildings were now dependent on the goodwill of others for basic survival. The loss of independence and status was often as difficult to bear as the physical hardships of their situation. Religious institutions played complex roles in refugee assistance during the time of troubles. Orthodox monasteries had traditional obligations to provide charity, but they were also struggling with their own survival and were often targeted by the various military forces operating in the region. The ability of religious institutions to provide help varied greatly depending on their resources, location, and political connections. The development of refugee camps around larger towns and cities created new forms of community organization that were neither traditional villages nor temporary shelters. These camps developed their own internal governance structures, resource distribution systems, and social hierarchies. But they were also extremely vulnerable to disease outbreaks, food shortages, and attacks by hostile forces that saw concentrated populations as threats or opportunities. The return migration that occurred when spring arrived created new challenges for both refugees and host communities. Families that had survived the winter needed to decide whether to attempt to return to their original homes, remain in their refugee situations, or seek new opportunities elsewhere. Communities that had provided winter shelter faced decisions about whether to encourage or discourage the departure of people who had become integrated into local labor and social systems. The documentation of refugee arrangements was often minimal or non-existent, creating ambiguity about obligations and rights that could lead to conflicts when circumstances changed. Verbal agreements made under crisis conditions might be interpreted differently by different parties, and the absence of higher authorities meant that disputes had to be resolved through local mechanisms that might favor established community members over newcomers. The long-term consequences of winter refugee movements extended far beyond the immediate survival of individual families. The redistribution of population changed the demographics of communities throughout the affected regions, bringing together people from different areas with different skills, customs, and loyalties. These population movements contributed to the cultural mixing that would influence Russian society for generations after the immediate crisis had passed. But what happened to the communities that were abandoned during these desperate winter migrations? What remained in the villages and towns that were left behind when their populations departed in search of survival elsewhere? And how did the landscape itself change when human settlement patterns were disrupted by the extreme conditions of the early 17th century? The abandoned villages scattered across the Russian landscape in the aftermath of the time of troubles were not dramatic ruins that spoke of sudden catastrophe, but rather places where life had simply drained away gradually, leaving behind structures that were too damaged to inhabit and too substantial to disappear quickly. These ghost settlements represented not just individual family tragedies, but the collapse of entire social systems that had sustained human life in one of the world's most challenging environments for generations. The process of village abandonment during the early 1600s was rarely sudden or complete. More often, it was a gradual hemorrhaging of population as individual families reached their own breaking points and departed for opportunities they hoped would prove better elsewhere. Historical records that entire villages succumbed or were abandoned as the starving wandered, desperately looking for food. But this abandonment was usually a process that unfolded over months rather than days. The first families to leave were often those with the resources and connections to relocate successfully. These were typically households with young, healthy adults who could undertake the risks of winter travel and who had skills or possessions that might be valuable in other communities. Their departure represented not just a loss of population, but a loss of the most capable and productive members of the community, making survival more difficult for those who remained. The social infrastructure that held villages together began to collapse as population declined. Community activities that required cooperation among multiple families, such as large construction projects, collective defense, or seasonal festivals, became impossible when too few people remained. The informal networks of mutual assistance that enabled individual families to survive temporary crises were weakened when the number of potential helpers dropped below critical thresholds. Economic systems that depended on community cooperation were particularly vulnerable to population decline. Activities like large-scale harvesting, construction of major buildings, or maintenance of community facilities required more labor than individual families could provide. As villages lost population, they also lost their ability to undertake the collective activities that made survival possible in the harsh Russian environment. The physical infrastructure of abandoned villages deteriorated according to predictable patterns. that reflected both the climate and the construction methods used in Russian peasant buildings. Traditional izba used wooden joinery without nails, making buildings that were designed to move with seasonal changes. But these same construction methods meant that buildings required regular maintenance to remain habitable, and structures left unmaintained quickly became uninhabitable. Roofs were typically the first major building systems to fail in abandoned structures. The steep pitches necessary to shed snow loads were maintained by interior support systems that were vulnerable to moisture damage when buildings weren't properly heated. Once roof systems began to leak, the damage accelerated rapidly as water penetrated interior spaces and caused structural timbers to rot or split during freeze-thaw cycles. The massive stoves that were central to Russian peasant buildings required constant maintenance to remain functional, and stove failures made buildings uninhabitable, even when their structural systems remained sound. Chimneys could be damaged by weather or settling, creating dangerous situations where smoke couldn't escape properly. The complex internal ducting systems that made Russian stoves efficient were vulnerable to blockages that could cause carbon monoxide poisoning or house fires. But the most insidious form of building failure in abandoned villages was the gradual destruction caused by animals and weather working together. Small animals seeking shelter would damage chinking and interior fittings, creating openings for larger animals and allowing weather to penetrate interior spaces. Birds nesting in abandoned buildings could cause significant damage to roof systems, while rodents could destroy interior furnishings and create fire hazards. The agricultural systems that supported village life collapsed more gradually than the buildings, but with consequences that were equally final. Fields that weren't cultivated quickly reverted to wild growth that made future farming difficult or impossible without major land clearing efforts. Carefully maintained soil systems that had been developed over generations could be lost within a few seasons if not properly maintained. Livestock that were abandoned when families departed faced starvation or predation. But some animals survived by reverting to wild behavior. Cattle, pigs, and sheep that had been domesticated for generations might survive for several seasons in the wild, creating feral populations that could complicate future attempts to resettle abandoned areas. These wild animals could also damage buildings and agricultural areas, making resettlement more difficult. The water systems that served villages were particularly vulnerable to abandonment. Wells required regular maintenance to prevent contamination and freezing, and systems for managing drainage and preventing flooding needed constant attention. Abandoned villages often became unsuitable for future habitation because their water systems had failed during the abandonment period. The social memory of abandoned villages was preserved through oral traditions and informal networks that maintained knowledge of what had happened in specific places. Survivors who had fled to other communities carried stories about their former homes, creating a kind of distributed memory that preserved information about resources, hazards, and opportunities that might be important for future resettlement. Efforts scavenging from abandoned villages became an important survival strategy for communities that remained in the region. Useful materials could be salvaged from empty buildings' timbers, hardware, tools, and household implements that were valuable to families struggling with their own survival challenges. But scavenging also accelerated the deterioration of abandoned structures, making future resettlement less likely. The spiritual dimensions of village abandonment were significant in a deeply religious society where communities were organized around Orthodox churches and where the spiritual welfare of the dead was a major concern. Abandoned villages often contained cemeteries and religious sites that required ongoing care, and the inability to provide this care created anxiety about the spiritual consequences of abandonment that extended far beyond practical concerns about physical resources. The ecological changes that occurred in abandoned villages reflected the rapid reassertion of natural systems when human management was removed. buildings that had excluded wild plants and animals were quickly colonized by species that found these artificial environments useful for shelter and resources. But these ecological changes also made future human use more difficult, as buildings that had been colonized by wildlife were often unsuitable for human habitation. The political implications of village abandonment extended beyond the immediate. Loss of population and resources, abandoned villages represented failure of local governance systems and loss of tax-paying populations that weakened larger political structures. The consolidation of population into fewer, larger communities changed political relationships and created new challenges for maintaining control over territory. That was nominally part of larger political units. But what happened when spring arrived? In these abandoned places, how did the seasonal cycles continue to operate in locations where human activity had ceased? And what signs remained to indicate that these places had once been home to thriving communities? Spring's arrival in abandoned Russian villages revealed the winter's damage with brutal clarity, as melting snow exposed the extent to which human absence had allowed natural forces to reclaim spaces that had been carefully maintained for generations. The seasonal transition that had always marked renewal and hope in occupied villages instead became a catalog of deterioration and loss that made the permanence of abandonment increasingly obvious. The first sign of winter's impact was usually the collapse of structures that had appeared sound when covered by snow. Buildings that seemed stable under their protective blanket of white revealed catastrophic failures once the snow melted. Roofs that had been gradually weakened by ice dams and freeze-thaw cycles would suddenly collapse when spring rain added weight that compromised support systems could no longer bear. The sound of falling timbers echoing through empty villages became one of the characteristic sounds of spring in abandoned areas. Water damage from spring thaw created destruction patterns that were different from the gradual decay caused by normal weathering. The huge quantities of water produced by rapidly melting snow would find its way into buildings through gaps in roofing or chinking that hadn't been maintained, causing rapid deterioration of interior spaces that had been protected during the winter months. Wooden floors, wall coverings, and furnishings would be destroyed within days by water that had accumulated gradually throughout the winter season. The agricultural areas surrounding abandoned villages told their own story of human absence. Fields that had been carefully cleared and maintained showed rapid reversion to wild growth during the first growing season after abandonment. But the patterns of this reversion revealed information about the farming practices that had been used and the natural systems that existed before human intervention. Areas that had been intensively cultivated reverted differently than fields that had been used for grazing or left fallow. The gardens and orchards that had provided supplemental food for village families were particularly revealing about the timeline of abandonment. Fruit trees and berry bushes would continue to produce for several seasons after human care ceased. But the quality and quantity of production declined rapidly without pruning, pest control, and soil management. Gardens would be quickly overgrown by weeds and volunteer plants. But the species composition of these wild plants reflected the seeds and growing conditions that had been established during the period of human management. Archaeological evidence of daily life accumulated in predictable patterns that revealed information about how families had lived and when they had departed. Household items that had been too heavy or too damaged to take during winter evacuation remained where they had been abandoned. Broken tools, worn-out clothing, and damaged furniture provided evidence of the material culture that had sustained village life and the economic conditions that families had faced before abandoning their homes. The remains of food storage systems were particularly informative about the circumstances that had led to village abandonment. Empty granaries and root cellars suggested that families had consumed all available food supplies before departing, while stores that remained partially filled indicated that abandonment might have been sudden or that families had been forced to leave before they could transport all their resources. The condition of food storage facilities also revealed information about construction techniques and preservation methods that had been used. Personal items that remained in abandoned buildings provided insights into family structure and social relationships that weren't available from other sources. Children's toys, religious items, textile implements, and personal decorations revealed aspects of daily life that were rarely documented in formal records. The distribution of these items within buildings showed how interior spaces had been used and how families had organized their domestic activities. The fate of domestic animals that had been left behind when families departed created ecological changes that affected the entire abandoned area. Animals that survived became feral and developed behavior patterns that were different from their domestic ancestors. These feral populations could persist for years, creating wildlife communities that were neither entirely wild nor entirely domestic. The presence of these animals could be detected through tracks, droppings, and damage to buildings and vegetation. Seasonal changes in abandoned villages followed patterns that were both predictable and unique to specific locations. Spring flooding affected low-lying areas differently than elevated sites, while exposure to prevailing winds created different weathering patterns on different sides of buildings. The microclimate within each abandoned village was influenced by factors like forest cover, water sources, and topography that determined how quickly and in what ways human structures would deteriorate. The plant communities that established themselves in abandoned villages reflected both the local natural environment and the modified conditions created by human habitation. Species that were adapted to disturbed soils might colonize areas that had been intensively farmed, while shade-tolerant plants could establish themselves in areas protected by remaining building structures. The sequence in which different plant communities became established provided information about ecological succession patterns in human-modified environments. Scavenging activities by humans from other communities created distinctive patterns of selective removal that revealed what items were considered most valuable during crisis periods. Tools, metal hardware, and building materials were typically removed first, while bulky items that were difficult to transport might remain for years. The patterns of what was taken and what was left behind provided information about the economic priorities and transportation capabilities of communities that survived the crisis period. Weather patterns affected different building materials in characteristic ways that created distinctive signatures of abandonment timing. Wood exposed to moisture would decay according to predictable patterns, while metal items would rust at rates that depended on local humidity and temperature conditions. These deterioration patterns could be used to estimate how long buildings had been abandoned and what weather conditions they had experienced. The spiritual practices associated with abandoned villages continued even after human departure, as surviving community members might return periodically to maintain cemeteries or religious sites. These maintenance activities created evidence of ongoing connections between survivors and their former homes, even when the villages themselves were no longer habitable. The care given to religious sites often contrasted sharply with the neglect of domestic buildings, reflecting the priorities of communities dealing with displacement and loss. But what happened over longer time periods in these abandoned places? How did the absence of human management allow natural systems to reassert themselves? And what could be learned from observing these processes of environmental recovery? Decades after the last human inhabitants had departed, abandoned Russian villages entered a phase of environmental recovery that was both fascinating and melancholy, as natural systems gradually erased the evidence of human habitation, while creating new ecological communities that were neither entirely wild nor entirely free from human influence. The process of rewilding was not simply a return to pre-human conditions, but rather the creation of novel ecosystems that incorporated both natural succession and the lasting effects of human modification. The forest reclamation of abandoned agricultural cloche. Areas followed predictable patterns that revealed both the resilience of natural systems and the extent, to which human activity had modified local environments. Fields that had been cleared for cultivation were quickly colonized by pioneer tree species, birch, spruce, and pine, that were adapted to grow in disturbed soils and full sunlight. But the species composition and growth patterns of these new forests were influenced by soil conditions, seed sources, and microclimatic factors that had been shaped by centuries of human management. The buildings themselves became ecological islands that provided unique habitat conditions not found elsewhere in the natural environment. Wooden structures created protected spaces that were warmer and drier than natural alternatives, making them attractive to species that were adapted to take advantage of these conditions. Birds, small mammals, insects, and plants that specialized in colonizing human-modified environments found abandoned buildings to be ideal habitat that could support populations for decades after human departure. Basement areas and root cellars created underground environments that remained stable in temperature and humidity, even after the buildings above them had collapsed. These spaces became refuges for species that required consistent environmental conditions, including bats that used them for winter, hibernation, and various insects and small mammals that found them suitable for year-round habitation. The microclimates in these underground spaces were often different from any naturally occurring environments in the region. The stone foundations and chimney bases that remained after wooden superstructures had rotted away created artificial rocky habitats that were colonized by plant communities adapted to growing in crevices and on stone surfaces. These stone structures also provided basking sites for reptiles and nesting locations for birds that preferred elevated locations with good visibility. The persistence of these stone elements meant that the ecological effects of human habitation continued long after all other evidence of human presence had disappeared. Water systems that had been modified for human use continued to influence local hydrology and plant communities decades after abandonment. Wells that had been dug to access groundwater created permanent water sources that supported plant and animal communities that might not otherwise have existed in those locations. Drainage systems that had been installed to manage agricultural water continued to channel surface water flow, creating wetland areas or dry zones that affected vegetation patterns. The roads and pathways that had connected villages to the outside world became corridors for plant and animal movement that influenced ecosystem development over large areas. These transportation networks, even when no longer maintained, remained visible in the landscape as cleared linear features that were colonized by edge species and used as travel routes by wildlife. The persistence of these corridor systems meant that abandoned villages continued to influence ecological connectivity across the broader landscape, introduced plant species that had been grown in gardens or had arrived accidentally as contaminants in crop seeds, created novel plant communities that were different from the original natural vegetation. Some of these introduced species became established as permanent components of local ecosystems, while others disappeared when the disturbance conditions that had allowed their establishment were eliminated by natural succession. The persistence of human-modified soil conditions created long-lasting effects on plant communities that developed in abandoned villages. Agricultural soils that had been improved through centuries of fertilization with animal manure supported different plant species than unmodified natural soils. Areas where buildings had stood often had soils that were compacted or enriched with ash and organic debris, creating growing conditions that favored different species than those found in surrounding natural areas. The archaeological record preserved in abandoned villages became increasingly valuable over time as the only remaining evidence of how rural Russian communities had lived during the crisis years of the early 17th century. Items that had seemed worthless when villages were first abandoned, broken pottery, rusted tools, fragments of clothing, gained historical significance as artifacts that documented daily life during one of the most challenging periods in Russian history. Animal populations that had become established in abandoned villages often developed into stable communities that persisted for generations. Feral cats that had survived the abandonment period could establish breeding populations that continued to inhabit the ruins. Bird species that had adapted to nesting in human-built structures might continue to use abandoned buildings as long as suitable nesting sites remained available. These animal communities represented hybrid ecosystems that were neither entirely wild nor entirely dependent on human support. The seasonal cycles in abandoned villages gradually shifted from patterns that had been influenced by human agricultural activities to rhythms determined entirely by natural processes. Spring flooding that had been managed through human intervention returned to natural patterns that could dramatically alter local landscapes. Without human fire management, natural fire cycles resumed, sometimes clearing large areas of accumulated vegetation and creating opportunities for new plant communities to establish themselves. The spiritual landscape of abandoned villages remained important to surviving communities and their descendants long after practical connections had been severed. Cemeteries continued to be visited and maintained by people who traveled considerable distances to honor their ancestors. These periodic human visits created subtle but persistent human influences that prevented complete rewilding and maintained connections between abandoned places and living communities. Climate changes that occurred over the decades following abandonment influenced the recovery process in ways that were different from the immediate effects of the Little Ice Age that had contributed to the original crisis. Gradual warming trends changed growing seasons and species composition, while variations in precipitation patterns affected forest succession and the persistence of human-modified landscape features. The knowledge systems that had sustained village life were preserved in the oral traditions of communities that had survived the crisis, creating cultural landscapes that existed in memory even when physical villages had disappeared. Stories about specific places, their resources, their dangers, and their history were passed down through generations, maintaining human connections to abandoned areas that might eventually prove valuable for future resettlement or resource use. Some abandoned villages experienced partial reoccupation as population pressures and economic opportunities changed over time. Individual families might establish homesteads in locations that had once supported entire communities, creating new patterns of human habitation that were adapted to different social and economic conditions. These new settlements might reuse some infrastructure from the original villages while developing entirely new approaches to survival in the same challenging environment. The landscape scale effects of village abandonment influenced regional ecological patterns in ways that were still visible centuries later. Areas that had once supported dense networks of small villages returned to forest cover that created habitat for species that required large blocks of connected forest. The abandonment of agricultural areas allowed the recovery of wetlands and other natural features that had been modified or eliminated during the period of intensive human settlement. The long-term legacy of the abandoned villages was ultimately a complex mixture of ecological recovery, cultural memory, and historical significance that reflected both the resilience of natural systems and the enduring impact of human habitation. These places became monuments to the extreme conditions that could make human survival impossible in one of the world's most challenging environments, while also demonstrating the remarkable ability of both human and natural communities to adapt, survive, and eventually recover from even catastrophic disruptions. The silence that eventually settled over these abandoned places was not the silence of death, but rather the quiet of natural systems gradually healing from centuries of human modification. In this silence, the story of Russian survival during the time of troubles continued to be told through the slow processes of ecological succession, the persistence of modified landscapes, and the cultural memories of communities that had endured one of history's most challenging combinations of social chaos and environmental extremes. And in that silence, perhaps, lay the most profound lesson of all, that survival itself, whether of individuals, communities, or entire ecosystems, depends not on the ability to control circumstances, but on the capacity to adapt, endure, and ultimately find new ways of living when old ways become impossible. The abandoned villages of 17th century Russia stand as testament to both human fragility and human resilience, reminding us that even in the most desperate circumstances, life finds ways to continue, recover, and eventually flourish once more. In the end, you would not have snapped sleeping blanketless in 1600s. Russia not because the cold wasn't severe enough to kill you, but because the intricate systems of survival that Russian peasants had developed over centuries were sophisticated, enough to keep you alive, provided you understood them, maintained them, and recognized when it was time to abandon them for something better. The real tragedy was not the cold itself, but the social and environmental chaos that destroyed these survival systems and forced entire communities to choose between equally dangerous alternatives. The real miracle was not that so many died, but that anyone survived at all to pass down the knowledge, stories, and cultural memories that would eventually allow Russian civilization to recover and flourish once more.